I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Kansas, I have a little bit of a personal connection to today's case. We're from Kansas. That's the connection. But I will say it is one of the first true crime cases that really sticks out in my memory as holding a fascination to me. He was caught in 2005 when I was a freshman at McPherson College, which is about an hour away from where he lived in Wichita, Kansas. BTK, or Bind, Torture, Kill, is the incredibly creepy nickname developed for Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is one of the creepiest serial killers I have ever come across. For sure, he is one of the most heinous in Kansas history. So for today, you're gonna need a really strong drink. I mean, I might argue that for a lot of our cases, we need a strong margarita, but for this one, woof. It's hard to say for sure who invented the margarita, if you were wondering, but it was definitely developed in Mexico and during the 1930s and 1940s. It may have been invented for a Siegfried showgirl that was allergic to all alcohol except for tequila, or for a Texas socialite, or for actress Rita Hayworth. Either way, I'm certainly glad that someone thought to mix these simple but delicious ingredients so that we can enjoy slurping them down while talking about murder. Today, we added an extra part of tequila. You're welcome. All right, so for this margarita, you may have noticed 3 parts tequila, 2 parts triple sec, 1 part lime juice, 1 part simple syrup. As always, we shake her up. And listen, take it from me, today, you might want to make it a double. Dennis Rader was born on March 9th, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. His parents were Mark and Dorothea, and he was one of 4 boys. His brothers' names were Paul, Bill, and Jeff. His mother was a bookkeeper for a local supermarket, and his father worked for Kansas Gas and Electricity. His parents worked long hours, which was something that Dennis definitely resented. According to Dennis, both of his parents ignored him, particularly his mother, and he resented her in particular for all of his life. Dennis was a Boy Scout, and his whole family attended Zion Lutheran Church, where he was confirmed at age 12 in 1957. Later, Dennis would claim that he had a traumatic brain injury from being dropped on the head as a child. More on that later. On the outside, Dennis fit in particularly well with his peers. But it was during his school years that Dennis began to develop unnatural, sadistic urges, including sexual fantasies that involved trapping and torturing helpless women. In what would be noted as a pivotal moment in his pathology, when he was around 11 or 12 years old, he was humiliated in class by a teacher. Later that night, he went to her house, tied a rope around his waist, and peered at her through the window. While staring at her, he became sexually aroused. He began to harbor a sexual fetish for women's underwear that would continue throughout his life. Dennis would capture and strangle neighborhood dogs and cats, sometimes hanging them in nearby barns. When he and his friends would go fishing, he would actually seek out other kinds of animals, like turtles, and also hang them. A quick note on that. Pleasure derived from cruelty to animals is known as zoo sadism. A 2003 psychological study suggests that zoo sadism in childhood may lay the groundwork for a person to be cruel or violent to humans in adulthood. These behaviors in childhood may not lead to violence in adulthood, but it is certainly a feature of a dysfunctional childhood. All of these moments are important precursors to what Dennis would do later in life. Dennis was an average student, graduating from Wichita Heights High School. He enrolled in Kansas Wesleyan University in Salina, Kansas, but would drop out after his freshman year, no doubt in part to his mediocre academic performance. He enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and served for 4 years, after which he moved back to Park City, which is a suburb of Wichita. In 1970, he took a job at Leaker's IGA supermarket, which was the same supermarket where his mom was a bookkeeper. He met Paula Dietz and married her in May of 1971. They would go on to have 2 children. He graduated with an associate's degree in 1973 from Butler County Community College. He then graduated from Wichita State University in 1979 with a degree in administrative justice. Ironic. Or maybe not. Marrying and beginning a regular old life did not cure Dennis of his sexual fantasies and urges. He was known to stalk his female neighbors, often wearing women's clothing. He would later say he was pretending to be his victims as part of a sexual fantasy. Dennis kept a secret box that he called the mother load. Inside were pictures of child swimsuit models with sexual fantasies written on the back of them. There were explicitly sexual drawings made by Dennis himself. He put selfies in there of him in pantyhose and bras in various bondage positions. Eventually, there would be drawings and photographs of his victims' last moments. Dennis took a job with the Coleman Company. You know, the outdoorsy place. Yeah, that one. In 1971. That's where he met a woman named Julie Otero. On January 15th, 1974, Joseph and Julie Otero sent their older 2 children off to school. The younger ones had a later start time for school. Joseph, who was 38 years old, was described as outgoing and jovial. Julie, aged 33, was described by her surviving children as a mother first, a kind, loving Catholic woman. At about 8:40 a.m., Joseph Jr. opened the front door to head out to go to school himself. He was 9 years old. Dennis approached and ordered him back inside, where he found Julie, Joseph, and Josephine, who was 11 years old at the time. Dennis would meticulously strangle all 4 members of the Otero family. Before her death, Julie pleaded with Dennis to spare her family and said, "God have mercy upon you." Their bodies were discovered later that afternoon when the older children came home from school. 15-year-old Charlie Otero would later say, quote, "It was just like if you ripped my chest open and tore my heart out." End quote. Just a few months later, Dennis would stalk and murder 21-year-old Catherine Bright, one of his many and future projects. His words, not mine. Catherine was one of 5 children and loved singing in the church choir. She was a college student and had a part-time job at, you guessed it, the Coleman Company. Dennis had been stalking her and made a plan to kill her. In the late morning, he broke into her house and hid in her bedroom. She arrived home around 2 p.m., but to Dennis's surprise, her brother, 19-year-old Kevin, walked into the house as well. Thinking quick on his feet, he rushed out of the bedroom with his gun pointed directly at both of them. He said that he needed money and a car to drive to New York. He forced the 2 back into the bedroom and ordered Kevin to tie up his sister. He took Kevin into the other room and tried to tie him up as well. But Kevin fought back, and so Dennis shot him in the head with his .22 pistol. Kevin hit the ground and Dennis thought he was dead, so he went back into the other room to deal with Catherine. Catherine put up a tremendously large fight against him, or as Dennis would say, she fought like a hellcat. So instead of strangling her, which was his plan, he stabbed her in the stomach. Meanwhile, Kevin actually wasn't dead, and he escaped, fleeing to his car. He drove to get help, but by the time he got back, Dennis was gone, and Catherine was mortally wounded. She would not survive her injuries. Kevin would survive. When Dennis was arrested 30 years later, the Boy Scout knife used to stab Catherine would be found in his kitchen pantry. In October of 1974, Dennis wrote a letter and stashed it in an engineering book in the Wichita Public Library. This letter would describe in detail the murder of the Otero family. Evidently, 3 different men had been identified and arrested and charged with the murder of the Otero family. Dennis could not let that stand. He had done the crime, and he wanted the credit. The letter would include this postscript. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their M.O., or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You see, he's at it again. From that point forward, this prolific serial killer would be known as BTK. Bind, torture, kill. And they say you can't choose your own nickname. This would begin a series of letters, cereal boxes, and messages that Dennis Rader would use to taunt the Wichita Police Department, terrify the public at large, and feed his own ego. It would be his ego that would be his downfall, but not for a few decades. Meanwhile, in Dennis's non-serial killing life, he took a job with ADT Security Systems, installing, you guessed it, security systems in people's houses. He took this job in 1974. As years would pass, he would install many security systems in homes of people that were scared of BTK. Dennis and his family would join Christ Lutheran Church and become very active in church life. At one point, Dennis would even be elected president of the church council. He was a Cub Scout leader for his son's Cub Scout troop. There was an aura of normalcy, of politeness, of a well-mannered, quiet man that made the idea of Dennis Rader being a vicious serial killer a stunning impossibility. In the early years, Dennis fully believed that his mistakes would lead to him being caught. The error of letting Kevin escape and evidence he had left behind led Dennis to fully believe that the game was up and that he would be caught. One morning, while Dennis was reading the newspaper, his wife came in and peered over his shoulder. She pointed at a word that they had plastered on the front page from a message from BTK saying, "Hey, he misspells that word just like you misspell that word." Dennis recalls thinking that he might have had to kill her right then and there, but she let it go and so did he. And Dennis made it his business to become an expert in serial killing and in crime. He read, he planned, he perfected. He assembled a hit kit in his bowling bag that included ropes and various weapons. In 1977, after 3 years of not killing anyone during what Dennis would call his cooling off period, he could no longer resist his urges. On March 17th, Dennis would murder 24-year-old Shirley Vian, leaving behind 3 children and her husband Richard. Shirley had a wide smile and also loved singing in the church choir. Shirley was a random kill. Dennis's actual project was a woman that he met in a bar named Cheryl, but on the day that he planned to do the murder, Cheryl wasn't home. So Dennis saw a little boy walking down the street and decided to follow him home. He knocked on the door and pretended to be a detective, and the little boy immediately let him inside. All 3 children were home, as was Shirley. He turned off the TV, closed all the blinds in the house, and forced the children into the bathroom by gunpoint. He would later say he put blankets and toys into the bathroom to comfort them. He told Shirley he would spare her if he could just have his way with her. Instead, he tied her up and strangled her with a cord. A telephone rang and startled him, so he ran out of the house, leaving the children screaming in the bathroom for their mother. This would be one of several houses that he would leave DNA evidence behind in. His next murder would become what he referred to as his, quote, perfect hit. Her name was Nancy Fox. He would deem it Project Fox Hunt. I'm sorry. Drink, please. Nancy Fox was 25 years old. She worked days as a secretary for a construction company and worked nights at a jewelry store. She had a very good sense of humor. Dennis would make Nancy his project from start to finish. He first spotted her as he was trolling the area. She was going into her house. After that, he did his homework. He figured out her name by looking at her mailbox, and he trolled the area. At one point, he went to her job. On December 8th, 1977, he cut the phone line outside and then went in through the back door of her duplex. He surprised her in the kitchen as she got home from her job at the jewelry store, and he told her he had a sexual problem that would be cured if he was allowed to rape her. She asked if she could go to the restroom first, and he said yes, but ordered her to come out of the restroom naked. When she emerged, he tied her up and strangled her, again leaving behind DNA evidence for forensics to later test. The next day, on his way to work at the alarm company, he used a payphone to call and report a homicide. Despite having a recording of his voice, the Wichita police were never able to tie that voice of BTK to Dennis Rader. In January 1978, Dennis sent a sarcastic poem to the Wichita Eagle. It was printed with children's rubber stamps, maybe even his own children's. Nice. I'll spare you, but it was a very obvious reference to Shirley Vian's murder. Evidently, there was some mix-up at the newspaper, however, and that particular poem was never published. Annoyed that his masterpiece was not being seen, he sent another letter to a local television station. It said, quote, "How many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?" End quote. What a freaking whiner. The letter claimed responsibility for the murder of the Oteros, Catherine, Shirley, and Nancy. Listen, it was bad before, but things are gonna get worse. I'm just warning you. I know you're all here for this, but I feel like I have to warn you about this one. Let's talk about Project Cookie. At this point, it's been over 8 years since Nancy's murder. Another cooling off period, as Dennis would say. He's living life, raising kids, being married, going to work, and doing a lot of creepy things with his box. The year is 1985, and Dennis is 40. Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old recent widow, is Dennis's neighbor. She lived 6 doors down from the Rader family for 30 years. Maureen was quiet and dependable. She worked the second shift at a coffee shop at the local medical center. She was a loving mother and grandmother. Dennis liked to watch Maureen as she worked in her front yard. On the evening of April 27, 1985, Maureen came home after a night out with her boyfriend. She went to bed. Dennis, meanwhile, was in the middle of a Boy Scout meeting. Faking a headache, he left. He parked his car at a bowling alley and called a cab. Carrying his bowling bag, remember, his hit kit, he had himself dropped off at his house and then walked the 6 houses down to Maureen's house. He hid in one of the bedrooms of the house until she got home and went to sleep. He went to the room, jumped on the bed, and strangled her to death. And in this next move that should make you want to drain your drink, he wrapped the body in a blanket and took it to the church, his church, in the trunk of his car. He then put her body in various bondage positions and took pictures of it with his Polaroid camera. He then laid her body in a remote ditch, covering her up with some branches. Vicky Wegerly was 28 years old and a mother of 2. She was a member of 2 local churches and was known to be unfailingly patient and kind. Dennis would call her Project Piano because during the 3 weeks that he spent stalking her before her murder, he would often hear her playing piano from the street. One day, he left work in the middle of the day and changed into his hit clothes, or clothes that he would later need to get rid of. He used the ruse of being a telephone repairman and entered her house on September 16, 1986. He went inside, pretending to check the telephone using some fake tool he had brought into the house. When she turned away, he drew his gun and forced her into the bedroom. He tied her up, but she managed to break free, fighting him fiercely. He managed to gain control over her and tied a nylon sock around her neck, strangling her. He thought she was dead, so he rearranged her and took some photos. The The dogs started to bark, so he nabbed Vicky's keys and drove off in her car. I don't really understand how the cars are working in this story, but just go with it. Vicky's husband, Bill, would say that on his way home, he saw the car going in the opposite direction, but he couldn't identify the driver. When he arrived home, he saw his 2-year-old son by himself in the living room. He found his wife in the back bedroom, alive but barely. She was rushed to a local hospital, but she would die of her wounds a few hours later. Okay, I promise we're almost done. Determining that older victims were better than younger victims, his 10th was 62-year-old Dolores Davis. Dolores lived about 1.5 miles away from the Rader family home. She was just a very kind and considerate and loving person, her son would later say. She was an excellent cook who made everything from scratch. She lived near a dog kennel, so Dennis called this one Project Dogside. He had cased the house previously, but couldn't really figure out the best way to break in. So on January 19th, 1991, he just threw a cinder block through the plate glass window and burst right in. She came out of the bedroom and he announced that he was a man in need of food and a car. He handcuffed her and got her car keys. He spoke with her and allegedly calmed her down. He pretended to gather some things and leave, but then he returned and strangled her with pantyhose. He would say that the 2 or 3 minutes it took for her to die would fuel his fantasies for years. Ugh, sorry. Similar to Maureen, he wrapped her body in a blanket and put her in a trunk. He then dumped her underneath a bridge. He would return the next day to take selfies with the body. It's worth noting that though Dennis killed 10 people, he stalked countless more women. 2 women that he stalked in the mid-1980s and one that he stalked in the 1990s actually filed restraining orders against him. One of them even changed her address in order to avoid him. After he became a dog catcher in May of 1991, people reported him finding pleasure in harassing people, especially single women. One woman would even claim that BTK killed her dog for no reason. BTK would go silent for the next 13 years. And by 2004, the case was officially cold. It would be BTK himself who would heat things back up. In January of 2004, the Wichita Eagle ran a story commemorating the 30th anniversary of the murder of the Otero family. It can only be assumed that Dennis read it, because about 2 months later, BTK would again begin playing the game that he would eventually lose. The Wichita Eagle received a letter from a Bill Thomas Kilman, BTK. The letter claimed that he had murdered Vicky Wegerly. The letter included photos of the crime scene and a photograph of Vicky's stolen driver's license. In May, a puzzle was sent to the local television station. A package would be found taped to a stop sign on the corner of 1st and Kansas on June 9th. Inside, police would find graphic descriptions of the murder of the Otero family. In July, a package would be found in the return slot of the Wichita Public Library, mirroring the letter that was found there in 1974. In October of 2004, a manila envelope was found at a UPS drop box, including, among other horrors, images of children in bondage. In December of 2004, Wichita police found a package from Murdoch Park. It contained Nancy Fox's driver's license and a doll that was bound at the hands and the feet and had its head wrapped in a plastic bag. In January of 2005, Dennis left a cereal box in the bed of a truck of someone who was at a Home Depot, but the owner of the truck threw the box away. The police were able to retrieve it later when Dennis had asked, "What happened to that package?" Surveillance tape of the parking lot revealed a figure coming from a Jeep Grand Cherokee dropping the box off into the bed of the pickup truck, but the person could not be identified. Letters were sent to the Wichita Police Department, and in one such letter, Dennis asked if a floppy disk could be tracked back in some way. Yes, it could, but in an ad published in the Wichita Eagle, the police said to whoever this person was that no, of course it couldn't. So Dennis sent a purple Memorex floppy disk to a local television station. The police then were able to determine from the floppy disk the words Christ Lutheran Church and a document whose last save had been done by someone named Dennis. Whoops. Caught. That, my friends, was enough for an arrest warrant, which was executed by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, the Wichita Police Department, and the ATI. He was arrested on February 25th, 2005. On June 27th, 2005, Dennis Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He described the murders in detail and made no apologies. Kansas did not have the death penalty at the time, so Dennis Rader was sentenced to 175 years in prison. So what do you think? What in Dennis's background or brain could have caused this level of depravity? How was he able to have such a mask of normality in his everyday life while simultaneously committing these absolute atrocities? Is it possible that no one in his life knew anything about this? How on earth was he able to wear that mask so well? And what if you were one of his family members? Could you ever forgive him for something like this? Listen, I watched the entire BTK confession video. It was public and you can watch it on YouTube, but I did it so you don't have to. There's one thing that struck me as I watched it, and probably everybody else who does, and that's how calculated it seems. I think that we can all agree that there is something not quite right with serial killers, but there's something about the way that he describes the murders. It's just so sterile, without any emotion whatsoever. Lucky for us, we have the real deal psychological evaluation of Dennis Rader. He was officially diagnosed with antisocial, narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. The evaluator noted that Dennis has a grandiose perception of self, or a belief that he is special, and therefore entitled to special treatment. He also has a pathological need for attention and admiration. And as we know about obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, a strong desire to maintain rigidity and order in his life. And obviously, a complete lack of empathy for his victims. In terms of our 4 types of serial killers, which, if you don't remember, include hedonistic, power or control, mission-oriented or visionary serial killers, we're going to go ahead and stick BTK in the power and control category. This, if you remember, is killing because of the addiction they have to the power they gain over their victims. Real piece of shit. In Dennis's case, where does this come from? Remember when he said that he fell and hit his head when he was a baby? Yeah, right. He also did a lot of reading about serial killers. Remember, psychopaths are born and sociopaths are bred. Pretty sure it was in his DNA. On July 26, 2005, Dennis's wife was granted an emergency divorce. His daughter was interviewed in 2019, where she said it was still hard for her to reconcile the father that she knew with the killer that he was, but she says that she's forgiven him. Dennis Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility. He is only allowed to leave his cell 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, for exercise and a shower. He is 76 years old, and I think we can all agree, an absolute piece of shit. Thanks for hanging out with me, and if you're not drunk by now, I highly encourage you to shake up another margarita. As usual, head over to our social media to continue the conversation. Links are in the description box. Speaking of the description box, next week we're experimenting with one of my favorite childhood drinks, but making it Margarita-y. The Shirley Temple. The description box has those ingredients for you to grab when you're out grocery shopping this weekend. And the crime? Well, it's a classic that you might have heard of when you were out on the playground, maybe jumping rope. I don't know. I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to murdering lots of people.